Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Benjamin Kinnear will defend the academic thesis From Evidence to Argument, Bringing Validity to Life in Health Professions Education Assessment. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Highly esteemed Pro-Rector, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to my esteemed opposition committee, to my supervisors both here and online, to family and friends who are watching on this Juneteenth, and to my family who are here with me, including my paranymphs. Thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to share this thesis work with all of you, and feel very privileged to be here. I think it might be helpful to start by sharing the story of how I got interested in this topic. I am a very pragmatically oriented clinician. I don't have a background in psychometrics or measurement, and this is a highly theoretical topic, so I want to keep things grounded in the practical road that led me here. And it really begins with the people I work with back in Cincinnati, Ohio. We, for the better part of a decade, have been led by Dr. Eric Worm in building a program of assessment to try to get a better sense of what our internal medicine residents can and cannot do. And I want to show you how complex this system is so you can understand why I wanted to explore validity and validity arguments even more. We have a robust workplace-based assessment system that involves a lot of forms, a lot of rater training, learning analytics, and dashboards. We've integrated clinical performance measures, both process and outcome measures, to understand how people are performing in the clinical space. We have 360 assessments where we gather data from faculty, from allied health professionals, from peers, from patients, and from themselves. We have a homegrown testing program that not only helps us understand where people are with their medical knowledge, but also shows us how they're interacting with the learning tools that we supply them. We have conscientiousness measures. Are you closing your charts on time? Are you doing your refills for patients in a timely manner? Are you completing those modules that you're supposed to complete? And we collect lots and lots of narrative data, not just quantity, but we also spend a lot of time building theories around understanding how to interpret that data and turn it into decisions. But our program of assessment isn't just collecting all these data, it's also being very thoughtful about how we use these data in our competency committee, trying to have theory-informed group decision processes. And so again, in this 40 seconds, I just summarized essentially 15 years of work. But for most of that time, validity was not actually part of our thinking. And I remember the very moment that it really entered the zeitgeist for our group, because again, we're mostly clinicians. We don't have training in validity or measurement. And it was the moment that we listened to the old school Key Lime podcast. And there was an episode where the hosts discussed a paper that was led by Dr. David Cook. And in this paper, Cook and colleagues described validity through Keynes' validity framework. And I'm not going to go deeply into Keynes' validity framework. It's not really super salient to this thesis. But the thing that stuck with us most and resonated with us was when he described validity as an argument. Not making an argument about validity, but validity itself being an argument that is made in support of interpretation and uses of assessment data. This really resonated with us pragmatically as clinicians. And one of the analogies that Cook uses in this paper is validity is kind of like being in a courtroom, where you're putting evidence together to support an argument that you're making. And so we did what we always do in Cincinnati, which is we just kind of try it out. And the first kind of toe that we dipped into validity was actually at a conference in Canada, either in 2016 or 2017. I don't quite remember which one it is. This is myself and the aforementioned Dr. Eric Worm putting on a workshop where we put our program of assessment on trial. And Eric did a very brave thing. He presented all the details of our assessment system, some of which I already showed you, but he went into much greater depth. And then we invited the crowd to come forward and cross-examine or critique our system as if we were in a court of law. And what you're looking at on the left there is a PowerPoint slide where we had hyperlinked multiple rebuttals. So each one of those little black squares with the number is a packet of evidence or a rebuttal for a question that we anticipated we might get. We tried to think this out in advance. So we had 29 rebuttals. And as this process unfolded, some of the questions we had rebuttals for and evidence to back up our approach, and some of them we didn't, and it exposed gaps in our thinking, and it was really helpful for us. So we took this process back to Cincinnati, and that's where we developed our first validity map. We continued this kind of discursive approach of asking questions and trying to give answers and evidence to support these things, and we mapped it out in this way where each one of these squares or rectangles that you're looking at is kind of a unit of question and answer and evidence to support or refute. We mapped it out using two different validity frameworks, one from Michael Caine, one from Samuel Messick. Again, we don't need to go into the details of those, but the reason why we used both frameworks is because what we found is some people really like using Samuel Messick's framework, some people really like Michael Caine's framework, and we wanted to be able to talk to as many people as possible. One of the things we really learned from this is how powerful that discursive exchange was with actual people, especially people who were not part of our team. Having external people ask difficult questions and then evaluate our responses to see if they held water was really value added for us. And the other thing we learned is that collecting validity evidence for a program of assessment is very messy. It's not a single assessment tool, it's not a single test, it's multiple different assessment tools being woven together, so it's messy and iterative, and this discursive approach really, I think, helped us navigate that mess. But there was something else that moved us forward even further to understand argumentation, and that was when we piloted competency-based time variable training. Now, in competency-based time variable training, the idea is that you advance somebody through training based on their assessment, your assessments of their competence, not simply based on time and training. And in the United States, this is a very novel thing. So as we engaged with multiple stakeholders on this, we got the same question from all of these people, certifying bodies, accreditors, institutional leaders. They all wanted to know, how do you know your assessment decisions about readiness for practice are valid? How do you know they're defensible? And I suddenly felt like I was back in the courtroom being asked to make an argument to actual real-life flesh and blood judges and juries, and I had this map of evidence. We had already built a lot of that, but I didn't understand how the courtroom worked. I didn't understand the rules of making the argument. I had all these questions like, how much do I tailor each argument to each particular stakeholder? Because they all had different things that they cared about. What's the standard by which they're going to evaluate my argument? This was no longer a single psychometric approach. This was multiple different things being woven together. How are they going to make the judgment on whether it passes muster? Which evidence should I foreground of everything that we had mapped out on that map and why? And how do I structure my argument? Is there a way to structure an argument? I really had no idea how to approach this. And that's when I learned there's a whole field out there that's been looking at this for centuries, going back to Aristotle and even before, called argumentation theory. Now, it's not a single theory. It's a field of study that draws from multiple disciplines like logic and mathematics and communication and rhetoric and philosophy and many, many others. And the whole idea of argumentation theory is that it explores arguments in real-world contexts. How do you evaluate them? How do you structure them? Who should the audiences be, and what role do audiences play? So we dove into the argumentation theory pool, and what we found was there are many, many different orientations or approaches to argument and argumentation, but there were two that were most salient to us for our field. One is informal logic. Now, informal logic arose when people said formal logic, which many of us have experienced in mathematics and maybe in school, is very useful, and we need logic, but it's so decontextualized and sterile that it was not very useful for the messiness of programmatic assessment. But informal logic, not only, it does two things that I think are most helpful. One is it starts to deconstruct arguments into its component parts. Things like, what are your claims? What are the data that inform those claims? What is the warrant that connects the data to the claim? And all these other pieces of argument, and it helps you structure those out. Two, it starts to give you some evaluation standards. Even if it's not super specific and proscriptive, it says the things we might care about for evaluating an argument are things like relevance, acceptability, sufficiency, and you can dive further into how you might operationalize those things. The other approach to argumentation that we thought was salient was new rhetoric. What we really liked about new rhetoric is the idea that it is so audience-centric. In fact, the only way you define a good argument in new rhetoric is, did you convince your audience of interest? And I want to be really clear that when we say persuade or convince, we don't mean manipulate or deceive. It just means persuading the audience is the most important thing. So we thought both of these were very salient to informing health professions education. But what we didn't know yet was, what is the current state of play in health professions education? How does argument or argumentation manifest currently? We took two approaches to try to understand this. One was we talked to who we thought were validity experts, and we defined that many different ways. I understand anytime you label an expert, you're including or excluding some people. We did our best using multiple methods. And two was we looked at our peer-reviewed published discourse, because that's how we often further knowledge in our field. And I'm not going to go through all the themes for all of these because of our limited time today, but I want to pull out the themes that I think are most salient to the take-home point for this thesis. One is that when we spoke to validity experts, they said that validity arguments should be social and situated. By situated, they mean it's contextual. Every argument has a context that it is tied to, and whether that argument transfers to another situation or not depends, and you have to have an argument for why that should transfer. The social piece is that an argument does not exist in a vacuum, that it is intended for an audience, whether it's a group or a person or an organization. And if you don't have that, that's a real problem. And when we spoke with our experts, they said the most important people to include in a validity argument as an audience are the people who have the most impact by the assessment decisions you're making, specifically learners and patients, which are people we rarely include in this process. When we looked in the literature, audiences were almost completely absent. When people talked about validity arguments and argumentation, there's very, very little attention paid to what role audience should play and who those audiences should be. And our experts said that's how they saw it playing out in our field as well. And as a result of all of this, it's really fascinating. We use the word validity argument quite a bit, but actual argumentation is nearly always missing. It's really validity evidence that we have and ways of categorizing evidence, but much about argument and argumentation is very much minimized. So whenever I write a paper, one of my supervisors, Dr. Varpio, always says, what is the so what? So I'd like to give you the so what of this, at least what I think is the so what. If validity is indeed situated and contextual, then validity arguments are needed at the local and program level. I think we do a pretty good job of this, at least in the US, for large certifying exams and national boards. I can tell you as somebody who has a window into many residency training programs in the US, almost nobody is building validity arguments, and I think many of the things that they do in their programs of assessment do not hold water as a result. If programs are using programmatic assessment, I think validity arguments are not straightforward. I think they are messy and multifaceted and dynamic, and I think argument and argumentation theory can give us some tools to try to navigate that. If arguments are inherently social, like our experts say they are, and like argumentation theory would propose, then audience is a necessary factor, and right now it's completely missing from our discourse. And if we really want validation to have meaning, then we need to have those audiences be meaningful stakeholders in our assessment decisions. Again, our experts thought patients and learners should have a voice in this, and right now they essentially don't. So the last so what I'll say is, if we actually were to operationalize this, if we were to actually bring in argumentation into validity in our field, and if we were to engage with those audiences, it might fundamentally change the scope of validity. Right now, I think many people consider validity to mostly be about construct representation. Are we assessing and measuring the construct of interest? And these other things like fairness and equity and consequences to patients and learners are related and important, but they're adjacent concepts. I think if we asked our learners what's important to you in a validity argument, or even our patients, I think many of these things become not only part of validity, but even central to validity. That if assessment decisions we're making are not equitable to learners, they're not going to hold up, they're not valid. Same with our patients. If we're not serving our learners and patients, this is a problem. And I recognize not everybody agrees with this. In fact, I quote in my closing chapter a validity scholar from another field that says if we bring in these moral aspects into validity, we turn it into Frankenstein's monster by stitching them all together. And I recognize this is a choice that we can make ourselves. And I think our North Star should be what is best for our patients and our learners, and we get to have that choice. In fact, I want to quote one of my supervisors, Dr. Varpio, who wrote, "Fortunately, ideology is maintained by our decisions and actions, and therefore we can change our decisions and thereby modify the ideology to work for us, not against us." And when I say for us, I think we mean work for our patients and for our learners. So either validity as an argument, conceptualizing it that way is just a bad fit for our field because we're not really doing it right now, or we just need some different tools, and the tools we're using right now aren't quite what we need. And maybe argumentation theory can give us some new approaches and some new tools to move forward. I'll just say thank you to my supervisors, to Eric, Lara, and Dan. You have made this more fun than I could imagine. I would do this 100 times over. Thank you to Joe Meredith for my artwork. Some people have thought it was AI generated. The artwork was generated by an Academy Award nominated artist. Thank you to the ABMS for grant support for one of my studies, to the research group in pursuit of validity, especially Dr. Christina St. Ange and Dr. Meredith Young for your support, to the Radical Lab back in University of Cincinnati, to my MedPeds family, and to my family. And with that, I will cede the floor back to the highly esteemed Pro-Rector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Kees van der Vleuten, Emeritus Professor of Education Science, specializing in medicine at this university. Professor van der Vleuten was also the chair of the assessment committee.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, fun reading your dissertation. And I think it's pretty bold to address such a complex topic as validity, because boy, have we seen some changes over time. You said you started as a practical clinician. I started a long time ago as someone studying trait psychology and psychometrics. And things were simple in that time. It was all about validity as a measurement thing, which is very much instrument related. Naturally, there were different aspects to it, but things were pretty simple. And then I moved into the field of education, and I quickly noticed that the concepts that were applied in validity theory in classical psychology did not apply to education. And I elaborated on the concept, and perhaps you remember my utility formula at some point in time. But things became even more complex because we started to move away from individual assessment instruments towards more complex programs of assessment. And also with a particular approach to it. And you mentioned programmatic assessment as a particular type of program of assessment, which has a lot of complexity to it. And all of a sudden, these traditional concepts hardly apply to programmatic assessment. So I was quite curious when I started to read your dissertation, because I'm completely infected by programmatic assessment. But I read little about it in the thesis. Only in page 121, you give me actually only one paragraph where you reflect on your validity approach and programmatic assessment. And it's particularly in relation to a more holistic approach to validity. So I would like to invite you to dwell a little bit about the applicability of your framework to be applied to programmatic assessment.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for those comments and for the invitation. One of the, I think, positives of being in the messiness that is a frontline educator and trying to build a program of assessment and understand what that means and implement it and find meaning in it is that you both appreciate and are frustrated by the messiness.
Right.
I think because it is so messy, because you are pulling together so many different assessment approaches and instruments to build up to some summative decision oftentimes, although also we use it for formative purposes. You could go on in the process of building a validity argument ad infinitum, as argument goes into argument, as goes into argument. And I think one of the most beneficial aspects of this, in terms of if we actually did make it a more social process and engaged with audiences, is simply prioritizing which parts of that messiness we want to explore with validity arguments. What is the most important thing that we need to collect evidence for and make claims about in a program of assessment? Because we all have limited resources, limited time, sometimes limited expertise. And if we
Could you dwell on that, particularly in relation to programmatic assessment, which is different from just a program of assessment? What sort of evidence would you consider to be interesting to be gathered?
Well, I think the most important thing to me would be to go to the stakeholders of the decisions we're making and ask them what do they think is most interesting and important.
Okay.
And the people I would start with are probably the people that have been left out of the conversation most, would be our learners, and if possible, representatives of our patients. Now, some people that we spoke with said maybe that's what, at least in the United States, what the ABMS certifying boards are, is to represent the public.
Right.
But I actually don't think that they are looking at our assessment approaches in the same way as a member of the public would. They are often trained physicians or people trained in measurement. And I mean, what would it look like if we took some of our patient family council members, gave them enough information and understanding of assessment that they could ask questions and ask them, what is most important to you that we collect in terms of this data? I do think, though, that we can't turn all of our validation over to people who have no expertise in assessment. The goal of this thesis was not to say that expertise in assessment is no longer needed. I think it's a both and. And can we find the room in our time and the resources to dedicate toward this? I think that's the challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in programmatic, if I look at your definitions around validity, they still strongly focus on decision-making. Huh? Validity is seeking evidence and arguments in relation to making informed decisions. But that's only part of programmatic assessment. Lots of it has nothing to do with passing or failing or with decision-making.
So in terms of other aspects of programmatic assessment, let's say, for example, the same system I described for us, we use to inform our coaching program with our learners. We use it to give feedback to our learners.
Right.
And we are very particular about the types of instruments that we integrate into that program of assessment to try to help us assess different things in different ways. I think you still need validity evidence for those things, especially because, for example, for formative purposes of assessment in programmatic assessment, learners can very quickly become skeptical or even cynical about the data that they are receiving. So I don't think validity arguments are just for summative decisions. I think it's also for things like informing growth and informing coaching and giving feedback.
Okay. So that will be possible also in your vision?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. So actually, if you think about it, you look at validity probably also using principles from programmatic assessment, because there's no such thing as a validity study. Because, you know, that's only one data point in a whole big picture of evidence around validity.
I really love that framing, taking a programmatic approach to validity, not just a single validity study. I think that's right. And I think that's where argument and argumentation can be so helpful, because there doesn't have to be an end. You can always have invitations to new people into the discussion. And if you look at how people often map out argument and argumentation, they often build on one another. So not to get too far into the weeds, but a claim that you might make for one argument, which is the end point, if you see that as justifiable, that becomes a warrant or a connecting piece for another argument. And so you really can build upon one another, much like scaffolding on a bridge.
Right.
I really like that framing.
Okay. Love to dwell with you on the strong focus in the US on certifying examinations and how they fit to a new approach to validity. Are they in trouble, you think?
I see one of my supervisors, Dr. Schumacher, smiling on camera. I think that there is a very important place for a board certifying exam of some kind, whether it's a written exam or a verbal exam. However, there's pretty good data that programs are knowingly graduating graduates that they know are not ready for practice. I think the most important gatekeeper for patient safety, for public accountability, is at the program level. So boards have their role. I think that role is debatable, how strong it should be in the US. However, the most important point is at the program level, and that's where I think building validity arguments is most important, to be quite frank, and most absent. I think if you looked under the hood, so to say, of most assessment systems in most programs, in any specialty, it's quite thin.
Yeah.
It's quite thin.
Okay. We'll talk about this some other time as well. Thank you very much, Prorector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Balmer, Professor of Pediatrics in the Children's Hospitals of Philadelphia. Professor Balmer was also a member of the assessment committee, and thank you for joining this academic ceremony.
Dear candidate, I would not use the word fun to describe my reaction to reading your thesis, but I did. And as you are aware, I am surrounded by others who are interested in equity in assessment here at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And so my question is sort of framed through things that I have learned about assessment through specifically Hannah Anderson and Dr. Dan West. And you write in chapter 3 about a democratic space. Specifically, you talk about creating such democratic spaces can ensure that all stakeholder voices are heard. And then in your opening conversation, you talked about validity arguments being social and situated, and you said who is most impacted. And I wonder, what would it look like if the question is not who is most impacted, but who is most harmed? And so what are the boundaries of that democratic space? Does everyone have an equal voice? And should everyone have an equal voice? Or is there a different way you could think about that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you so much for that question. I also have learned so much from some of the people you mentioned, specifically Hannah Anderson. And before I get into specifics, I will just say one way that I've heard her frame discussions around equity is to have a justice-oriented lens, and I think that could be very informative in this type of discussion. And when I say justice-oriented lens, I mean taking into account social, political, historical forces that have played out over and through time, and how does that impact whether somebody can actually participate in a conversation like this, and maybe who should or should not. It's a really interesting question, and I want to check my positionality. I am a cisgender, heterosexual, white man from America. I don't want to be a gatekeeper for who should or should not take part in this conversation. I think everybody should have an opportunity to participate if they can. And in terms of understanding what validity arguments should look like and even participating in validity arguments at the local level or a national level, I think it should be part of our goal as education leaders to give people the tools that they need to participate as much as they can or want in this discussion. That includes, I mentioned already, patients and learners, which was identified by our experts in our qualitative study. But specifically, people who come from marginalized identities and backgrounds, people who've been overlooked, people who we know the foundation of assessment systems are actively harming and were not built for. I think, in particular, we should invite those people into these spaces, or we're going to continue to build systems, specifically assessment systems, that continue to cause the harm that you mentioned before. So I think we should look to history and to the broader lens of what's happening in our world to help guide us about which voices are most important to amplify for this conversation.
Thank you. I have one more question, and this is more of a methodology question. As you know, I do quite a bit of qualitative research, and so I was just really enjoyed the paper, the reflexive thematic analysis in chapter 4. And being the sort of the methodologist that I am, I focus a lot on how the analysis was done. And something in that section just raised a question. Clearly you have experts on the team. So this is not a criticism of the analysis, but something that just raised a question. You write, you had 3 independent coders interpreting the data, again, not to get at this triangulation, but to generate insight. Then after multiple rounds of coding and discussion, we shifted to having these 3 authors code a common source text in Quirkos. And I'm just wondering, can you recall or discuss the shift, why you went from 3 sort of independent coders to having them use a single source?
Question. There's a twofold answer for that, I think. One is, as I was growing as a researcher, I was really struggling to come to terms with the idea of socially constructed knowledge and what is the purpose of having multiple coders. And my very patient supervisors repeatedly talked me through that, and it took me time to be okay with the idea of multiple people coding a single source and seeing each other's codes and that kind of thing. Another was a pragmatic issue. With Quarkos, it's a really wonderful software, but it's challenging to code on a single text without seeing what other people are doing, and we repeatedly had to code separately and then upload, and everything kept getting mixed up in Quarkos. So it became pragmatic enough once we were pretty sure we had some shared understanding that we could all code on the same actual text in Quarkos, and I had let go of a little bit of my angst about, no, we must code separately, otherwise we're going to quote-unquote bias one another. And so it was partially growth on my part and patience of my supervisors, and partially a very practical software-based thing.
Great. So no more Quarkos for you.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not, yeah. I will cede the discussion to the next opponent.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Oudkerk-Pool, educational consultant and researcher at the Fontys University of Applied Sciences.
Thank you, dear candidate. First of all, I would like to congratulate you on the completion of your, I think, exceptionally rich and also well-considered dissertation, and my compliments also go out to your supervisory team. I think the dissertation offers an extensive and also in-depth piece of work that invites for reflection on how we, within higher education, and more specifically within health professions education, understand, justify, but also use validity as a benchmark for the quality of our educational assessment. I think this really makes your dissertation relevant. It also offers food for thought on how we might engage with this concept of validity in future educational practices. In thinking about it, it encourages us to reconsider our engagement with validity and offers new perspectives that really challenge us and challenge our current thinking. And I was wondering, reading chapter 2, you describe how you constructed a validity map, drawing on the theories of Messick and Kane, as you also just presented. You use this to structure the collection of evidence supporting the validity of your assessment program. Later, in chapter 9, you advocate for a very, I would say, comprehensive conceptualization of validity, where you see it as holistic, participatory, community-based, agentic, and equitable. And I was wondering, looking back at the methodology you also used in chapter 2, to what extent do you believe that this methodology already does justice to this more broad vision? And looking back from the perspective you offer in chapter 9, would you and how would you redesign or implement the methodology perhaps in a different way?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for that thoughtful question. I think the approach that we took in chapter 2 checks some of the boxes that I mentioned in chapter 9. I certainly think it was participatory in a way, but many of the other ways I don't know that it checked the box. It certainly wasn't very agentic in the sense that we were not being thoughtful about the fact that we got to shape the reality of how we think about validity. We felt a little bit like we had to play by existing frameworks, and we were just seeking out evidence to fill those boxes. Certainly, I don't think it was equitable, both in terms of who we were engaging in that process and in terms of the type of evidence that we were foregrounding. I do think that the most powerful piece of what we did was to actually have what felt like meaningful real-world argumentation in some way. And I think in a lot of ways, that's the biggest hurdle to climb. That's the biggest activation energy. One of the things that I've wrestled with is, what does all of this mean to actually implement in the real world? And there are many ways you could go about it, but I think the biggest thing to do is to somehow get people communicating, and by people I mean developers of an argument and those stakeholder groups, the audiences, whoever you tend to prioritize, to have that discourse. And how that happens, I think, is up for debate. But that participatory and community-based, I think, is the most important thing. I think if you do that, equity will rise to the top because people will demand it. So I think what we did was crack the door open to show that by having a little bit of fun where I get to bang a hammer and watch my colleagues sweat it out in a room with other people, that we really did stumble onto something that was of value and moved us forward so much faster than only publishing papers ever would have, I believe, at the local level. Let me also just be clear, I am not saying that peer-reviewed publication is gone. It's a necessary step. But I think for a local validity argument, we accelerated much faster through that discursive approach than anything else. So if I could go back, I would do it very differently in terms of who we engaged with, how deliberate we were in the decisions we made, and how we thought about validity and the questions we asked. And we would have had equity closer to the top of our list in our answers as well.
Thank you. And I think this also relates to my second question, because you also now emphasize the importance of involving these diverse stakeholders. And among others, you mentioned patients several times as potential stakeholders. And I think the inclusion of patient perspectives is increasingly acknowledged as a key aspect of our also quality assurance in medical education. But also what we see in several ways is that it's really difficult to do, because how can we involve them also without maybe putting too much burden on the patients and making it feasible? So maybe could you elaborate on that? What would be your thoughts about that? How could we do that?
Thank you for that question. I think a couple things. One, more and more, as you said, we're doing this in healthcare. At our institution, and I think at many institutions, there is like a patient family advisory council that already is involved in many decisions about healthcare. And we've started involving them in our education programs for other things as well. I think sometimes we might underestimate how curious and able to learn things our patients are. And I also wonder, how much advanced knowledge do you need to have on psychometrics, validity theory, these things? Do you have to at least participate in the conversation? There probably is a limit, and there would be some education that would need to happen. But I'm sure there are patients or patient representatives who would be up to the task. And it would be really interesting to try out to say, what information would you need to meaningfully participate in this? Do you need to understand a G study? Probably not. Do you need to understand the idea of how many times do you need to be observed in a given context? Maybe they can be part of that discussion. And again, doesn't mean that they set all standards, but they are invited to participate in the discussion. So I think the only way we'll know what we will need to truly invite patients and families into that conversation is to try it. And every time I worry if people can actually do it, I'm pleasantly surprised to say they are going to outshine our expectations. So I think we should try.
Thank you. And then I think also continuing on your conceptualization of validity as holistic, participatory, community-based, your dissertation, I think, is very rooted in a context in which participation and argumentation are also maybe key educational and also assessment values. And I was wondering, in such systems, you approach to validity as something co-constructed and in a dialogue. It aligns well with, you could say, the broader cultural principles. And I was wondering, how do you maybe assess the applicability of your approach in an educational system, but also a broader cultural context where maybe authority, hierarchy, more traditional norms are still quite, you could say, apparent there?
Yeah.
What would be your thoughts on that? What's the applicability of your view on validity?
Thank you again for those questions. I do think that if we are going to actually deploy something like this and try it out, that we should have thoughtful program evaluation. In terms of how you could go about doing that, I do think a useful a way of trying to go about program evaluation could be like realist evaluation, which is very context sensitive and starts to ask those questions: what works for whom, under what contexts, and why? And I don't know that this would apply everywhere, nor do I think even if it applies now, because I do think many of the things that have influenced my writing and my thinking for this thesis are rooted in socio-political, contextual things happening, at least in the United States. But that may change over time, specifically how I mentioned we should pull equity and fairness and things like that into our validity arguments. Maybe 30 years from now, we don't need that anymore. But right now, in this moment, I think we do need it. If we get to choose how we're going to think about validity, I think it's a necessary thing, at least in the United States. Other places, other cultures, other countries might look at this and say, we don't do co-construction, we don't do participatory approaches to things like this. And who am I to say what is right in that context? So I'm very sensitive to the fact that this may not apply everywhere. And in fact, one of the things that I am very sensitive about and reflecting on is like, I am continuing to pile on the narrative about validity in our field that comes from a Western, white, male viewpoint. And probably somebody else should pick up this discourse, tear it to pieces, bring in new voices, and say, this is how it would look in my context. And I would invite that.
Thank you. And I give the word to the prorector.
Will be continued by Dr. Mewissen, researcher and resident in internal medicine at this university.
Thank you. Dear candidate, my congratulations on your really wonderful, unique work, and I also want to extend my congratulations to your team, of course. I think it's really unique both inside but also outside. I really wanted to have said that. So thank you for letting me be here. And I think you already touched upon some aspects that I want to continue the conversation on, since I think you really put some attention to the reflexivity part, your personal reflection, and you state that your worldview has shifted over time. But I think indeed that the world has also changed during the time of your the writing of your dissertation. And one of the aspects I want to start with, at least, is the role of AI. And I came across the word AI only once, but maybe that's me. But on page 95, you state that improving technologies such as haptics and artificial intelligence could provide real-time assessment. And then I thought, but what is the role of AI? And when I say AI now, I mean actually large language models mainly. In your whole thought on validity?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for that question. I think, who knows what AI's role is going to be, but more and more AI, I think, is seen as part of our teams, and maybe someday would even be an audience. And one way I could see validity or AI having a very helpful role is as a tool to generate maps of validity if we want to do that again, or generate the questions we should be considering, or helping us find evidence to support the arguments that we're making. You also wonder if there could be an assistive tool for if we do invite patients and families into this conversation, is that something that helps them navigate a very complex sea of information? I do think one thing, in that specific passage, we're writing about using AI in assessment in general. I do think use of AI in assessment needs to come with its own validity argument that should support it, because so much of AI is a total black box to all of us. There's a few gatekeepers who understand how it works, but all of the challenges that come with AI, including the equity challenges, all need to be part of a validity argument to bring that in. So it might be something that we need to build a validity argument for, and part of a tool that we use to build those validity arguments, which is kind of circular in a way.
Yeah. So maybe going back to the previous conversation, that could also have been something you could have changed in chapter 2, maybe, to let that play a role as well, but you used real people instead, indeed. And indeed, I agree that it could be something also to help other stakeholders to understand this concept. And that's actually leading to my second question, because I was a bit surprised, working in the clinic as well, to read that, that you stated that some fields, for example engineering, may have a prominent discourse of validity as test characteristic, which while somewhat passé in medical education. And then I thought about certain clinicians still walking around, and I felt like, is it really passé? And how could we maybe change or persuade, like you used before, those people regarding thinking about validity and argumentation?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the word passé can have a negative connotation, and I was using it in a very literal sense of sometimes people see it as that is not the contemporary view of it. I think you're reading from the med-ed models part, if I'm correct. Is that right? I don't remember exactly what section I used that word, but I have gotten much more. One of the ways I've grown is through the discourse analysis, learning the importance of being very thoughtful about the words you choose and how you use the language. And for example, the mythopoesis that has happened about validity and gatekeeping, about what is a contemporary view, what is a passé view. And I do think that we should invite many different ways of thinking about validity into our field. That if people want to see validity differently than validity as an argument, that should be welcomed, because we are kind of a mixture of all sorts of different backgrounds that have formed health professions education. I do think it's also okay to acknowledge what the predominant view at this moment is in terms of validity as an argument, and that may also change. So yeah, that would be my response.
Yeah, thank you. It was indeed from the model. Yeah. And then actually already also moves to the third question, talking about the changing world, and you also touched upon the political forces we're witnessing at the moment. And talking about equity, which you just also did again. And I think that's a really interesting combination at the moment. And right now, you wrote validity should be a scientifically, but also a social construct. But it could also become a more political construct, talking about the fact that validity also includes equity. So I really wonder what you think about it, and how we could prevent it to become maybe a political construct.
That's a great point. And I think one of the ways I specifically have changed is now I think everything social is also political, as I've developed a more critical viewpoint. I actually don't think you can ever separate the two because of how humans work. It was really interesting to me that the day that I saw this thesis get published online, my first reaction was actually worry, because my home institution and my home state and my home country, there are real world consequences for people who write some of the things that I've written in here, especially if my name and my institution is put to it. And that was all put into motion after I had done all this work. I'd like to think I would have done everything the same, but to your point, everything now, at least in the United States, if you utter the word equity or move into that world at all, is a political view, and political views can have consequences. That being said, I think that's probably always been true. I'm just much more sensitive to it, and I have not had to navigate that, again, as a white, cisgender male in America. There are many people who have to think about this all the time in everything that they say and they write. So I don't think it's a poor me situation. I think it's a very helpful learning situation. And my personal opinion is that we should not stop saying these things, even if there are consequences, because things are going to change eventually. And I don't think we're always going to be afraid to say and write these things.
Thank you. I have some time left, yeah? So talking about excitement, I'm looking at the Frankenstein monster. So let's also talk about that, which is quite exciting to see as well. Because I think you described this broad view of validity, incorporating all the aspects that were just mentioned. But I wonder, are there sort of limits to the broad view of validity? So does the monster of does Frankenstein monster need to be like hold tight in a way?
Thank you for asking that. I do think, in full disclosure, I have a little bit of affinity for Frankenstein's monster because I kind of look like him. I can relate to the tall, broad shoulders, large forehead appearance. So in that sense, no, I think you should let the monster do whatever he wants. But it's a great question, and there certainly are boundaries. And I opened my thesis talking about how we have these God terms that we apply to everything. And I don't want validity to be that way. I don't want everything to be, well, the validity. But where are those edges? I actually don't know, and I think we won't know them until we invite those other people into the discourse around validity. There also are trade-offs in terms of if you bring those things under the tent of validity that I proposed in my thesis and in my slideshow, equity, acceptability, consequences, there are trade-offs to that. You lose a little bit of resolution in what you are saying in your discussion versus if you split them out, such as with the utility equation, some things in there are split out differently. So it's always a trade-off. And the reason why I talk so much about agency is right now, in my context in the US in this moment, I want to do everything I can to pull those concepts to the forefront. And validity has such a revered place in our discourse. I think I cited, people say it's the sine qua non of assessment. And if there's any way to pull those concepts to the forefront, because that's what our learners and our patients care about, then I want to use validity in this moment to do that. And then maybe, hopefully, someday we'll be in a place where we don't have to do that, and we can put the monster to rest.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Joosten ten Brinke, Professor of Learning and Assessment at this university. Professor Joosten ten Brinke is also the secretary of this degree committee.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, congratulations on this great achievement. All studies have been published, and you have also created a very practical and accessible webpage on a complex subject such as validity. I think people in the field will really enjoy this, reading this, and understand what you have done in your 4 or 5 years. I don't know how long. Your work also builds well on previous research into argumentation-based validity in educational assessments. Obviously on the work of Kane, but also on the work of our Dutch colleague Saskia Wools. You used her also you mentioned her in your booklet. And she's a colleague here working at CITO, the test center, test creation center, comparable with ETS in America. And her study was about 10 years ago. And she also published on the lack of in-depth argumentation in practice. And your studies build on that, but deepen it further and broaden this topic. And I have looked at multiple argumentation theories. And Dr. Wools stayed with the Kane model and in comparing with the Messick. Now, secondly, I really found it interesting how you see the mismatch between the theoretical views of the experts and the practical of health professions education in validation. Just a short question to start with. Who do you think will be using the outcome of those validation discussions in practice?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for that question. I think most of my focus, to be honest with you, is, as I mentioned, I think trying to get some traction with this work at the local or program level. So the outcomes of those discussions, I think, can be even localized to an individual training program or institution, because that is where I think the most consequential uses of assessment data happen, whether it is for summative decisions or helping learners grow. So I think the users of each of these arguments might be very local and small, but might be the most impactful. I think the same thing could play out on a larger level as well for a national certifying exam. And in fact, I think there is quite a bit of evidence, for example, of certifying exams in the United States, but there are many other things we do for assessment in a national way that I would say the validity argument for is either unknown or thin. And so I think it could play out in these grander, broader scales or very local scales, but to me the local scale is the most interesting and most important.
And then you think about assessment experts or teachers or colleagues?
I would love to see a mixture. So I think somebody with insight into assessment theory, validity theory can really enrich and guide the conversation. But one of the things I've learned on this journey is that there is a wide gulf between many of the frontline educators in my everyday world as a program director and people who are writing the papers that I'm reading to write my thesis. And I think the magic happens whenever we get both of them together. People who understand the context and the real world struggles of assessment because they're using it and doing it and trying to make sense of it, and the people who understand the theory and write the papers. I think it should be a great team of people. One of the limitations is it's hard to find assessment and validity theory experts in most programs. I've been thinking about this for 5 years and I still feel like I'm just getting a fingerhold in understanding all of these really complex topics. Most institutions or most programs don't have that.
Yeah.
So how do we make this happen when you don't have a ready availability of that expertise is a great question.
Yeah, very good. And that brings me to my second question, because I would like to discuss with you the role of the patients and students. And in your previous answer, you didn't mention them as users of the outcomes, and I can understand that. Repeatedly you refer to the patients and students as crucial but often neglected stakeholders in this discourse. Coming back to the Keynes model, Keynes model refers to a chain of inferences in his interpretation use argument. And you mention the 4 inferences, scoring, generalization, extrapolation, and implication. And I think extrapolation is often consists of 2 steps. First on from the test domain to the competence domain, and then competence domain to the practice domain. And that is for me where the practice is coming in, so the patients and the students. That argument phase is followed by an evaluation phase, so in which the inferences are evaluated in a critical way. It would be important to involve the public in these validity arguments, according to your dissertation. And you believe that validity arguments should be more participatory and local, already said before. And from a perspective where you start at the score, so in this chain of inferences, I can see your point that we should include students because they get the score, and so it's very important for them. But from a design perspective, and in who are using those outcomes of these kinds of discussions, I'm not sure I agree with you. That score didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of a well-considered design choices, starting from the mapping the practical domain. And in that phase, students and patients or experienced people provide input for that discussion. So, and based on that practice, discussions with the practice, we come to the competences, and we come to the test domain, and then we come to several assessments or a program of assessment. So I think because the students and patients are already involved in the design phase at the start, it's not necessary to include them in the validation process. How do you see that?
I think I would respectfully disagree. Mm-hmm. One, I actually think we do a very poor job of involving students now, even when we try our hardest. It's very challenging. And I guess this is where I would back up to, I mentioned Hannah Anderson earlier and what I learned from her, that there are often design choices when it comes to assessments and assessment systems that are laden with assumptions and biases, that if we had only asked the right people, they might have helped us see the problems and the harms that they were going to cause. And I've never seen an assessment system that has been that has engaged those people, whoever they are, that have been marginalized or straight up harmed by assessment systems. I've never seen a system that has engaged them well. Even with the design, even beyond the scoring inference, the assumptions that are laid into what is competence, what can be observed, what can't be observed, how do things extrapolate or otherwise.
Yeah, and I agree that that's a very difficult discussion, and therefore I think if we have the experts and they ask the correct questions to the students, to the final users, that we can extract what they need in the assessments.
Yes, I agree with that. So I think that's actually the discursive process that we would need. I think whether we ask them or we actually involve them to help us design it could be two edges of the same sword. but they should have more participation in the whole process. But you do need both. I don't think that we could do this by saying assessment designers and experts are no longer needed. They absolutely are, because another huge problem with assessment systems or programs of assessment is people who don't know anything about assessment design and validity theory putting things together out of convenience. So I do think it is a both and. One of the reasons why I wanted to pull out the participatory nature of this is I don't think anybody, well, I take that back. Few people would argue that having an assessment designer or an assessment expert is helpful or needed. I don't think that many people think of this other side of it of when you're building your validity arguments that you need more than just these assessment experts or validity experts. So, yeah.
And coming back to at the design, at two parts of the same chain, I think we can move forward and backwards between validation and then redesign, and then that's the way I think we can use reuse the outcomes of those validation discussions. How do you see that?
I totally agree with you, actually. That's one of the nice things about, again, taking an actual argumentation approach to things, is it's not only flexible, but it is also iterative in the sense that you may move into one section to build your validity argument or explore it, and then you may move back and use and then go back to it.
Thank you very much.
Benjamin Kinnear, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company that we can stay in this room and wait or return to this room.
Please all rise.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile or die. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Benjamin Kinnear, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taken into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Driessen is authorized to confirm upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please all rise.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Benjamin Kinnear, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Professor Schumacher, the floor is yours.
Dear Dr. Kinnear, dear Dr. Kinnear, dear Ben, congratulations. I'm so incredibly proud of you. So incredibly grateful to go on this journey with you. I cannot express how much I wanted to deliver this laudation in person. That was actually the plan, even though you didn't know that. And it could not have been closer to being realized than it was. But I will need to wait just a little bit longer to congratulate you in person. When I do, I'll share a gift from me, Eric, and Lara, a framed print of your unparalleled thesis cover. Your cover actually reveals so much about who you are and what you value. So I'm going to highlight a couple of those things. First, the cover places you in the background and your supervisors in the foreground. I suggested that you change this, but you didn't take my advice. Why didn't you take my advice? Because that's not who you are. You began nearly every email to your supervisor team with "Dear Supervisors," capitalizing the letters in super. Your gratitude for our involvement was unmistakable. But here's the secret that I'm still not sure you believe. We are also grateful to have you as our PhD student. We learned more from you than you learned from us. You set the pace, you read voraciously, you brought your keen intellect and writing prowess, you made decisions and vetted them with us rather than the reverse. But we didn't just learn how to be better academics from you. We learned how to be better people. A little over 2 years after your mother, Debbie, passed away, you sent us an email from her home where you were on vacation. You included a photo of you and Mila, the early risers, reading, sitting in a spot on the deck facing the lake that your mom would enjoy her morning coffee from. You were finishing up a book on thematic analysis by Braun and Clark and reminded us that the setting, or remarked that the setting was good vibes for some qualitative reading. This was not the first time I felt inadequate with your ability to devour books at the speed that I can devour letters to the editor. So it's not surprising to me that I did not remember this part of your email until I looked back at it recently. I suppressed it as a survival mechanism of working with you. What I did remember was the rest of the email. You were reading where your mom sat each morning. You were reading alongside Mila. You shared the family tradition of the homemade boat race. Then in the midst of your work to change the field of health professions education, you showed us what really matters and why we do this work to improve how we train and ensure the next generation is ready. You showed us how family and work can unapologetically commingle and how we can be successful academics and loving parents in the same moment. Thank you for sharing your full PhD experience with us. We are better because you did. What else does your cover reveal about you? It demonstrates how much you value friendships. The cover was done by Joe Meredith, as you mentioned, an Academy Award nominated animator who's a longtime friend for you. Deploying his talents is another example of how you do not view your world with you in the center of it, but rather with others in the center. I cannot possibly recount the number of times you've done this for me. You are never too busy for me, even as you expand your leadership roles. You never say no when I ask you to work with me on something new, even if the idea starts out as underdeveloped or my modal tuning starts at an 11 on a scale that goes to 10. You always support me and never judge me, even in my prolonged negative stretch that COVID precipitated. You are the person I have the most constructive disagreement with, but you're also the person I have the most synergistic agreement with. It would not be fun to always be right. I would not learn anything new, and I would not be forced to better support my ideas. Iron sharpens iron. We hear about peer mentoring. We hear about near peer mentoring. You are a near peer role model for me. One final thing I think your thesis cover reveals is your incredible ability to draw memorable analogies and connections. Your back cover says it all. Does a broad argumentation-focused view of validity transform it into Frankenstein's monster? Perhaps in some ways. Or maybe there's something more complex to this monster than simply a lumbering personification of malice. Like the lightning in Frankenstein, the social and dynamic nature of argumentation can awaken HPE validity to be participatory and agentic, engaging the real-world audiences and inviting them to help co-create validity arguments, allowing us to integrate values such as equity and social accountability into our validity arguments. I prefer a monster with life, engagement, and values to a lifeless, inconsequential husk. Having reflected on what your thesis cover reveals about you, I'm also struck by what is less evident on your thesis cover. While the cover conveys so much about you, it does not convey the extent to which your work is practice-changing, upending decades of conventional thinking in our field. But you don't have to believe me. With permission, I'm going to share what a reviewer for your first two studies wrote. And this is not just any reviewer. This is Professor Lambert Schuworth, a luminary in assessment. To your first study, he wrote, although the opening sentence of a reviewer's report can sometimes be a bit of a commonplace, like, thank you for allowing me to review this manuscript. In this case, I really want to thank you for allowing me to review this manuscript. It was an absolute pleasure to read. Every sentence appears to be purposefully crafted to contribute to the story. Lorelei Lingard would be pleased. No, she would be enchanted. You're not the only person who learned to love the thesaurus from Professor Lingard. To your second study, Professor Schuworth wrote, very rarely I see a manuscript on which I have no comments at all, especially given that I see myself a critical reviewer. However, this is such a manuscript. It reports a very thorough and rigorous study and reports it in a very accessible and logical manner. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. When I asked for his permission to share components of reviews, he did not miss the opportunity to underscore the value of your work. And I'll send you what he wrote to me, and he sends his congratulations. But Professor Schuworth was not the only reviewer who you had to contend with doing your PhD work. Immediately following one of his positive reviews that I just shared was a review from someone from the community who felt threatened by your work. Your holus bolus approach, as they put it, made them uncomfortable because it led them to question if their deeply held beliefs were wrong. Ben, this is how you know you're doing good work. You may remember Shrikant Iyer, one of the pediatric emergency medicine faculty who left St. Children's for a division director job about a decade ago. He is a quality improvement scientist. And he once told me that you know you're doing practice-changing work when many people don't buy it, or even resist it initially. He posited that they are so stuck in traditional ways of seeing that they cannot see what you see, or they are so stuck in traditional ways of seeing that your way of seeing cuts to the core of their identity. They are like the smoke jumpers in the Man Gulch fire. They cannot drop their tools because they are part of their identity. Thank you for letting me be part of work that challenges how people think, that makes people uncomfortable in positive ways, and is practice changing in health professions education and beyond. Maya, Adela, Emila. Ben says that gratitude ends and begins with you, his family. I may have not started with you, but I'm definitely going to end with you intentionally. I know you are Ben's world, but I also know from personal experience that the schedule of a physician and a physician working on a PhD can pull you away from family at times. This is the unavoidable nature of multiple important things, sometimes needing focus at the same time. My discussions with Ben are parts of my day and weeks that I cherish. He teaches me new ways of seeing that I would not come to on my own. He always has time for me, even when he is busy. He invests deeply in my work and not just his work. And he never judges me, even when I give him reasons that he should sometimes. Thank you for sharing him with me. My work and personal lives are better for it. Beyond me, thank you for sharing him with the health professions education community. There is a reason Ben is asked to give so many talks and collaborate on so many projects and papers. It's not just because he's funny, witty, affable, and people like working with him. It's also because he's brilliant, seeing ideas and insights that others do not. As his PhD demonstrates, he pushes convention and advances thinking internationally in our field. Ben, for someone who has found innumerable ways to make your PhD, your professional life, and your personal life about others rather than you, today is about you. Celebrate. You've earned it. You deserve this moment. I am so proud of you, and we are so proud of you.
Thank you, Dan. I don't have anything to say other than thank you. It means a lot.
Dear Dr. Kinnear, it's also a pleasure and honor on behalf of the Maastricht University and the Board of Deans to congratulate you with this new degree and with this title of doctor. I believe your supervisor or in his laudatio already expressed what you have done, and I believe also what will be expectations for the future in your research domain. We, the university and myself, we wish you all the best in the future. So hereby I will close this academic ceremony. We will make a picture here also in front of the screen so that the supervisors and also the opponent, Professor Balmer, is on the picture. And after that we will move to the central hall and we make a second picture on the stairs in the central hall. Hereby I close this academic ceremony.